Hello. Welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode, welcome to the Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode 21, Force, Power, Rule, and Persuasion. This is a series of ruminations that I've been doing once a week based on ideas that I had in a previous project. And now what I've done is I've kind of like redone them on a different platform, mostly for my own good, so I can kind of get a sense of putting these ideas together in terms of some context, so I can basically use them for myself, if nothing else. But anyway, so we're on episode 21. Let me give a kind of quick rehashing of what happened. We started in, I believe, December. Yes, it was the 1st of December last year, 24. We talked about the operation of the metaphor. We talked about that as something that was kind of a base principle and operation in the work that I do in terms of my thinking, writing, and building. I'm an architect, researcher, draftsman. And basically, this is kind of like the kind of overall understanding of how I've come through to get to the place where I am doing the work that I do. So we talked about the operation of the metaphor. Then we broke the metaphor down into what I call three different pieces. There was what I call the organic metaphor, the artificial metaphor, and the unbreakable bond, or what I call proto-metaphor, the sociological aspect of metaphor. So that was basically kind of talking about the fact that I believe that the things like symbiogenesis and ideas like artificial entanglement and other things that we see as kind of talked about are all part of the accretion that leads from simple to more complex to more intricate through what I would call entanglement, which I believe is a process of metaphor where things combine to create more sophisticated, more complex, more intricate things. We see it in nature, we see it in art, we see it in, so what I see is that we come to understand that these things happen in an organic way, and then in fact our metaphorical operation that we use in kind of art and literature is actually not an invention. It's a discovery of this as something that exists, that's simply something we borrowed. Kind of like my idea of what I would call natural morality, which is that, a lot of times, especially Christians believe that they have kind of come to create these kind of these ideas of kind of ethical structures and morality, that it comes from the teachings of the Bible or the Torah or whatever, or the Quran. But in fact, my feeling is that you actually have observed these things in nature, and that your principles do not come down from on high. They're basically things that you understand as things that you've modeled from watching the world around you, but not consciously aware of it. So as a result, this is the kind of situation that I've come to see as the fact that we didn't invent the metaphor. We discovered it as an operation. I talked about Bernowski and critique of Chomsky and language, and that in fact that this is something that kind of transcends language into something that language simply is embedded in and entangled in, not something that it comes from. And that kind of led me through other things. That was kind of the basics. And then it went into kind of different things about the way in which we kind of exercise these discussions. And then, like I talked about the idea of criticism and the idea of what was interesting, and there's been a kind of ongoing theme throughout these things, was the idea of kind of indicator of what I call societal health, which relates to the proto-metaphor, or the kind of sociological aspect of the unbreakable bond. And two books that I'll talk about tonight, which were written around the same time, and I'm not really sure. I know obviously the authors were aware of each other because they're both prominent philosophers in the 20th century, one being Ortega y Gasset and the other being Alfred North Whitehead. Of course, they come from very different backgrounds, even though they're both European. Ortega from Madrid in Spain, and Whitehead, from Britain, and then into America and at Harvard. But one comes through, in terms of Whitehead, he starts out life as a mathematician and a logician, writes Principia with Bertrand Russell, and basically kind of moves through there and goes into, I guess, history of science, and then into philosophy, and into kind of like what eventually becomes kind of like what I would say the resurrection of metaphysical thinking given the fact that philosophy had kind of run aground and had kind of run adrift metaphysically, which kind of gave rise to some, I think, some kind of like, again, these are just my ideas. I'm not saying that this is the case, but this is how I look at these things. I feel that the kind of like non-metaphysical aspects of philosophy that kind of like became kind of like the analytical aspect and kind of like had to contrast with the continental. The continental had kind of run adrift, and I think part of it was the failure that you would see in the kind of people like Javier Zavidi and some of the people who were part of like the kind of people who followed after Ortega, or kind of like the people who kind of followed after kind of Heidegger or Wittgenstein, basically could not really comprehend the kind of tumult that it kind of ended up with kind of Hume and Kant, and the idea that like these kind of metaphysical speculations were unrealizable. But anyway, I mean, it's not a philosophy course, but I mean, I do believe that the idea of changing the focus from being to becoming, and the idea of process philosophy, was something that kind of resurrected the possibility of metaphysical thinking, which I think has been somewhat staggering for people to comprehend, and as a result has kind of put people in a kind of somewhat awkward position in terms of the resurrection of metaphysical thinking. Anyway, there's a lot of political thinking, sociological thinking, and as a result, I think Ortega basically talks about civilization as, his book, Revolt of the Masses, is kind of analysis of what he sees as the coming problems of the rise of a certain kind of critique of a kind of egalitarian democratic system, which I rejected, but now have come to think that there might be some unfortunate truths to that I kind of can't condemn, and kind of have to go back and look at democracy and see it as a kind of something that may have some tragic flaws that need to be dealt with. On the other hand, Whitehead kind of, and his kind of idea kind of traces through the sociological, the cosmological, the philosophical, and I think the end was the last one. What's the last one? I should know this. I can't believe I forgot it. Let's go. I have the book right here. So the last one is civilization. Yeah, that makes sense, because the whole idea is the fact that these three components basically will kind of give you an understanding of how these things take place. Anyway, so the thing is, what happens is, our title is Force, Power, Rule, and Persuasion. And there's an interesting piece where Ortega talks about the fact that you can basically have force, but you don't rule. And he talks specifically about the time when Napoleon basically had force over Spain. And he talked about the fact that in terms of rule doesn't come through force. It comes through the ability to kind of like be able to kind of sit firmly in a circumstance and understand the ability to chart an understanding of your destiny in terms of what it is that you have to be. And that, of course, becomes the basis for his critique between the aristocratic man, or in this case, the genius, and the rabble, what he calls the mass. And I think what he talks about in general quickly is the fact that the aristocratic or genius individual is a person who puts upon himself additional circumstance from which he has to understand how to chart the course that either will fall above or fall below the destiny of his time by embracing that circumstance. One of the things he says about the mass man is that the mass man is a person who expects nothing and demands nothing of himself, as opposed to the genius who basically has nothing but demands upon himself. And I think that's a fair assessment, given the fact that there are people today who have understood that this organization that we have, and that both of these authors talk about this. Again, like I said, these books both come around the same time as 1930. So, in 1930, we're kind of like in the Depression. We're kind of looking at the fact that we see the coming fascism, the coming socialism, the coming communism. We see tyranny, we see oppression, we see the fact that there are kind of certain things that we've come to understand are not perfect. at this point, let's see, 1930s, the Weimar Republic is starting to kind of show some prosperity based on the 20s, but with the Depression that kind of reverses, and still the tremendous resentment of the Treaty of Versailles, which on the right becomes something that would become a real split that would kind of galvanize certain people towards an idea where they felt as if this kind of tyranny was justified. But again, this is a time when political parties had their own militias, which is not something that we see in most organized Western countries, but we do see it in other countries. I see this in something I would see in North Africa, the Middle East, or Asia and Southeast Asia, where, governments political parties will have their own militias, which are basically armies. So we have this kind of faction fighting in the streets, not just by kind of like rabble, but basically with actual kind of militias, people who actually saw that the political arm was something that controlled a military arm. Again, we're kind of still coming out of, the Kaiser and kind of understanding that, the Weimar Republic lasted 20 years. It started after the Second World War and was gone. It was done by 1933. So this is not a long time. But again, that's also something that you have to consider in terms of thinking about this when you make parallels between the United States and Germany in that time, because this was a situation that was very different. And this was kind of, I think people overlook some very interesting asymmetries. Anyway, back to this. So, let me see if I can find that passage where he talks about it. But I'm probably not going to be able to find it. But anyway, I'm not going to bother to take too long. But he talks about the fact that it's the individual that has the ability to persuade. And he doesn't use the word persuasion. That's something that I kind of that's something that's more in the kind of the section that the sociological section that Whitehead talks about, where he basically says that we've come from force to persuasion, and that's something that becomes part of the spirit of what moves us in what he sees as this incremental process or incremental movements or circumstances or objectives. No, not objectives, circumstances that we kind of move. Just like there would be an accretion, that there's a kind of difference. I mean, one of the things I always talk about is the difference between change and progress. And I think the idea is change may just be moving an object from one place to the other, that something changes. But the reality is this incremental move towards civilization from a less civilized state, this move to a more intricate, complex state from a simplified state, this is progress, or at least the term that I use is in that, in terms of entanglement, in terms of developed intricate metaphors, the idea of like a symbiogenesis, as Lynn Margulis would say. These are the things that we start to recognize. And I think one of the things that happens is I find a beautiful kind of synchronicity between the kind of small scale microbial world that Lynn Margulis talked about, and the kind of Darwinian idea, where we kind of see that in the end result, that's not the initial, that's the end result from an initial situation, that without these ideas of mitochondria basically becoming part of the structure of the cell, we would not be able to give rise to these kind of complexities that move us towards more complex organisms. More complex organisms become competitive, but at the same time, there's a cooperative aspect, where there's a symbiogenetic aspect that basically propels us in that direction as well. So maybe when you isolate at the large scale, you kind of have a tendency to kind of not see the cooperative, you see more the competitive. But the idea of certain kind of starvated, if that's a word, can create that idea of starvated, or kind of like needy is not the word, but maybe starvated. The idea of like certain necessities come about as a result of a lack of resource. So whereas you have people fighting over an excess of resource, maybe when there is a kind of like a lack of resource, you could actually have a situation where an opportunity kind of presents itself. I mean, one of the things that I love is the fact that one of the kind of realms of science that I've kind of seen develop in the last, I'd say, decade or two has been the idea of horizontal gene sharing, and the fact that certain organisms have the ability to kind of take out those things that they see are necessary in order for them to kind of adapt to a circumstance. But again, this goes back, I think this is something that we can definitely see within the kind of work of Lynn Margulis and the kind of symbiogenic kind of aspects of what she talks about. So anyway, in this regard, we go back to this idea of persuasion from power. I mean, kind of read the beginning of this portion here, which I was kind of looking at this week, because I kind of really beat this thing up a bit. It's like I look in here, there's like bookmarks everywhere, there's like annotated. I kind of really have, I've been very hard on this book, but I think it's kind of one of these things that you kind of keep going back to, and you kind of keep saying like, oh yeah, and there's a kind of deeper kind of like, oh yeah, now I see what that was. But anyway, I love the kind of like, going back to here, I think it was page 75, From Force to Persuasion. The gradual development of persuasive agencies in the communal life of mankind was not wholly due to the energizing of ideas. And that's important. I mean, there's this idea that somehow one day some sage just kind of walked up and kind of started to kind of like speak persuasively, and then suddenly, the kind of like the circumstance before, was disappeared. Now there is an unbreakable bond that comes about, but it kind of developed and then took over gradually. Now, a lot of times what happens is, there's this belief that certain things, happen because certain people made them happen, and that the people who were alleged to be opposed to them kind of like were simply overpowered, when they actually were usually sometimes the majority. I mean, I see this a lot in kind of in current discourse about certain things, not giving agency or giving praise or even acknowledgement to the fact that certain things happened because the people were able to see the injustice, and that the people that had a minority that may have served that injustice or kind of like created that injustice were simply overruled by other people who kind of were able to say like, hey, this is wrong and this needs to change. And I think the idea is that the people who feel that they were disserviced by the circumstance were the people who actually changed the reality, when in fact, no, they were basically the people who were benefited by the fact that others changed that reality, because they were able to see this as reasonable and said, hey, this is wrong, it has to change. So that's what I think is kind of right off the bat important to understand, is that this was something that was always embedded, but the balance has shifted over time, that there always was that idea of persuasiveness as opposed to power. Now, again, I think what we see is we are still in that balance, and we're still kind of weighing that out in terms of this idea of force as opposed to persuasion. And I think that our current situation, I see, is an indictment towards the circumstance, because of the fact that I believe we're shifting back towards force and away from persuasion. One of the things I think that comes up a lot is what I talk about in terms of, criticism and discussion. And I think one of the important unbreakable bonds that we've talked about recently is that created in criticism between observation and discernment, and the idea of separating out intent from the information. So in that case, what happens is, if you see the information and your ability to discern value in it should be the primary motive. But that goes to this bigger question of like, what is the case? And I think the case is the individual has to understand how to be able to discern the value of information. There's so we go back to this idea of like the idea of the authority in terms of ideas, which was something we talked about. Now, there's the authority in persuasiveness, but the persuasiveness comes from the ability to understand the value of discerning. Now, there's what people would call the authority of the argument or the argument from authority. Now, I believe both have a value, but I think what happens is ultimately, if the second one, meaning the argument from authority, has value, it's only because they can demonstrate the authority of the argument. And what I mean by that is, if I have a circumstance where I say, "Hi, P. Oh, P, we didn't see your drawing last week."
Oh,
Yeah, so bring it out. So he's like, we're going to have a really special situation. Julie's going to show us her drawing. Show us the drawing in action, because I think we wanted to talk about it briefly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So anyway, so back to the idea is that, like, if you are capable of okay, so yes, we are. So this is Julie's drawing from. I gotta do it so I can kind of get some glare.
Maybe angle it.
There we go.
Yeah.
We have an angle at Merkel there.
That's funny, and you might want to.
I liked her.
Zoom in. I thought she was really.
I thought she was brilliant. She was.
Maybe zoom in so
she has a looker too.
No, she was actually competent.
I know, exactly.
And rational.
See, exactly. See, I look at it this way. Somebody was telling me about, like, women and politics, and I was talking about Eileen Collins. I'll talk about that.
Yeah.
Is that, I feel that when someone is competent, it's unprofessional, it's incorrect to talk about them in that way, because it's disrespectful. Because you would never talk about a man in that way.
No, you wouldn't.
No,
they aren't a woman
because exactly, it's not
politician.
exactly. But I mean, one of the things that came up this week was, these 6 individuals went into space, and actually, let's talk about this piece. This was a piece. Yes. Well, I can't because it'll get bigger than the frame.
Oh, I meant if you do a quick close up.
Okay.
That's what I mean.
Okay. Yeah, I love this because it had this Art Nouveau frieze detail, which is like, tell us quickly about what it is. This piece at the bottom here is a piece from the Met that became animated because of this piece from a kind of like micro architecture organism that basically has infested and therefore animated this Chinese vessel from the Bronze period.
It's called,
is that kind of like an despair assessment?
It's called Magna Porthae Masquerade. Now, Magna Porthae oryzae, or M. oryzae, is a really powerful predatory fungus that causes like $1 billion worth of damage to rice crops, or 3 billion worldwide. It decimates wheat, it decimates rice, and there was a recent discovery in the fascinating world of mycology, exactly the mechanisms which are adaptive. They are brilliant mechanisms. It presents a masquerade. It creates an apparent situation of phosphate starvation in the plant, which thinks it's starved of phosphates, and that allows the fungus to penetrate its cell walls.
Trojan horse.
Yes.
Trojan horse.
In fact, it's not starved of phosphates.
Right.
It is a masquerade.
So in a way, it basically says, I need this, and it lets it in. Actually, it's been worse than the Trojan horse because it takes it in desperately and is less likely to be very circumspect. And as a result, it sees how this mechanism, which you've demonstrated here, coming from the surrounding tissue, invades the kind of the bronze piece, and then basically dissolves it into a series of structures that then are kind of reduced to their inherent textures and patterns that can be used to kind of like show the destruction of the piece.
Yes, and if you zoom in,
because what's beautiful is there's a 2-dimensional freeze aspect here, but this is so volumetric.
Well,
which one? On here?
Yeah, if you bring it up and you zoom in on the bottom, there.
I hate this because it's all backwards.
Yeah, well, sorry,
go ahead.
There's nothing we can do. But why this vase? Very importantly, because it has fungus handles. This vase, it's a different type of fungus. In fact, the handles on this ancient Chinese bronze vase, now on view at the Met, actually, are Lingzi fungus, which is a very famous long life fungus that actually does have powerful health preserving and life extending qualities. And at the very top this stylized, as you said, Art Nouveau frieze is in fact my stylized abstraction of the actual surface
of the
of
mechanism.
the leaf.
Yeah.
Of the leaf. If
Yeah.
you hold it at that angle, it doesn't have a lot of glare.
But it's kind of very,
Anyway,
and what's good is like
Yeah.
when we found was that, you know, looking at the new bronze exhibit at
Mhm.
Chinese Wing, is
Yep.
there are these incredibly animated, surrealistic vessels
Oh yeah,
that even
they're
though
incredible.
that when you take them out of the circumstance of like
Yeah.
being these iconic Chinese shapes, when you look at them in terms of like using them entangled with these
Mhm.
microbiological organisms and mechanisms, they can very easily become these very surreal kind of like animated kind of pieces.
Hi, Puddle.
Hi, Pete. All right, so where was
Okay.
I? So
Thank you, Puddle.
back to the idea of the argument is the fact that in the case of persuasion, what makes an argument is the idea that we have the ability to illustrate to someone, and with their ability to have discernment, the consequence of the idea that's being recognized under observation. So the idea is, if I make observations that maybe give you a reason or moment for pause to say, I need to consider this. And as a result of considering it, it allows me to persuade you to something that I believe, regardless if it's right or wrong, is of consequence, because the reality is it's up to the individual to decide what is of consequence for them. And one of the things that's being hotly debated right now, and I think it's a misunderstanding of the individual's intent in the debate, and I think it's a little bit of a kind of an emotional weakness on a lot of the people involved, is that an expert or an authority, right, is not necessarily the only person who can speak of a topic, but it's assumed that the expertise has been gained over time. My feeling is the authority, right, as opposed to expertise, comes from the ability to consistently manage to make the most compelling and persuasive argument in regards to the circumstance under scrutiny. So the thing is, I come to see a person with respect, and that authority comes from their ability to consistently demonstrate to me their ability to understand and be persuasive and be compelling and to make valuable insights. And I think the critique last week or the week before was the fact that some people have a tendency to say things that are provocative simply to get attention. And really it's because of a lack of understanding or ignorance about the actual circumstance that allows this to happen. And as a way, it's very kind of like distracting, because it's not based on the idea of being persuasive. It's the idea of being provocative. Now, being provocative is not a terrible thing, but what happens is we've lost that other part, which is the discernment part, which is the ability to be skeptical and to look at the information and not be biased about it. And as well, also not basically feel as if like I'm going to just take my emotional bias and kind of run with it. So I think there is an ability where it's really good to be able to say and have freedom. And we've talked about this here, is the fact that social liberty and freedom need to exist. And there was also something, and I was reading in Whitehead this week, is the fact that the liberty of commerce is also something that leads towards a kind of an emancipation and a kind of move towards progress in terms of civilization. And he talks about that in the idea of kind of force to persuasion, which is the fact that the liberty of commerce and credit are things that are also recognized as kind of valuable consequences and actually psychological realities as well. So as I see it, the authority of the argument comes from the ability to make a compelling argument for a kind of persuasive component that has consequence and value. Now, the value of the argument from authority is not just the fact that this individual says, I am the authority here. It's the fact that if this person is believed to be an authority, which usually is recognized, that person is very likely to be the most likely person to say the thing that is going to be the most of consequence. But it isn't a given. So the idea is there are places where one would say not having a basic understanding of the circumstance may allow you to initially say something provocative that may sound brilliant. But I think one of the things that happens is there's a lot of people who say things that basically last for 10 minutes and are kind of forgotten. And there's a reason why we still read Plato and Aristotle and Whitehead and Ortega and Nietzsche, and that even after thousands of years, we still go back to read Marcus Aurelius and Cicero and understand the fact that these things still carry consequence. So I think what we're seeing is two basic arguments. Ortega's being the fact that as a result of creating, opening Pandora's box, the mob has been put in a circumstance where they now, given their fact that they feel as if they have no responsibilities, obligations, and we see a lot of times where certain groups are not ever held accountable and are never given agency, and their actions are never held to in any kind of accountability. And I think that is kind of one of those things of that idea, is that the rabble or the mass man has no expectations and feels no obligations and puts none on himself, as opposed to the excellent man or the genius who feels as if in order to understand and appreciate the destiny that is the circumstance of every individual of every generation, you have to do so. And otherwise, basically, the organization that we assume and we take for granted is not a good idea, because that can basically become ruinous. And I think we're seeing that. I think one of the things I've noticed since COVID is the fact that certain logistical and infrastructural things were neglected. And I just find that there's a kind of like lack of efficiency in organization that I feel is something that we really have lost the ability to attend to. So my question is, are we simply not paying attention to the ship, and is it drifting because we're just not paying attention? Or if we were to pay attention, is there anything we could actually do about it? Is it actually too far gone? So my question is, maybe it's not just a question that we are not being driven properly, is that we may not have the ability anymore to drive. And that's kind of like, I think, something that I see more and more the case starts to worry me. Again, when I watched the situation out and I saw in places like, when I saw the earthquakes in Turkey a few years back, I was kind of realized that, like, well, these people never had any intention to build a serviceable infrastructure. So therefore, as a result, I kind of felt, this was something that they understood. It was never a priority, and they were just a corrupt bunch of people who were going to just hope that when it happens, it just doesn't happen too severe. I also saw the Fukushima situation, where we saw a situation where something almost unforeseeable happened, and there was a series of disasters that were kind of capable of creating a circumstance that then in the aftermath, we saw the fact that the corruption of the individuals involved, basically, even though they were very well organized for doing what they thought was necessary and having a robust infrastructure, when that infrastructure failed because of circumstances beyond their control, even though they had done a very good job in trying to have nothing beyond their control, it was the corruption of how they handled the aftermath, which was more disturbing, not the way that they hadn't, as Japan has always done, have a serviceable infrastructure that deals with a tremendous amount of potential calamity. So that brings me to the circumstance of Los Angeles. And regardless of the situation, I think one of the things that was really troubling to me was, as a result of ideological concerns, they had taken their eye off the ball and had not understood the fact that California survives and exists because it is a difficult infrastructural engineered circumstance. And if you don't pay attention to understanding and upgrading and keeping it sustained, it will fail in this kind of catastrophic way. So the excuses aside and the reasons aside, it brings me to the question of, we understand there is man-made climate change. We understand that the climate's changing. Regardless of reason, the climate always changes. The climate has changed from the day that, we were once a molten ball And now we're basically, 3.7 billion years later, here we are. So our climate, if it's, has had changes as a result of industrialization. True. Question for me is, right, what is the optimal circumstance for organic life on Earth? Are we approaching that, or are we moving away from that? And the second thing is, if we are there any circumstances that are not engineerable? Because one of the things that I think, I look at as a great opportunity for this is, why do we not enlist our engineers and architects, just like we didn't do in California, and make this, let me finish. Make this an engineering circumstance. What I remember thinking is, just like we have a Secretary of Interior and a Secretary of Agriculture, I believe there should be a Secretary of Architecture and Engineering. And I mean that by the fact that we should understand that there's an engineering aspect to having a national civilization in the United States, so that it's not just a question of, should we have water for a fire? Because that's a stupid question. The question is, how do we make a robust engineered system in complex infrastructural circumstance? So if I was a Secretary of Engineering for the United States, and I'm an appointed official, the idea is, aside from great things like, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do, aside from the sustainability and the clean and this and that, the idea is, do we have a workable system? And I look at the fact I live in New York City, and if anyone was to tell me that the MTA was a workable system, I would tell you, you're a liar. Because honestly, we're looking at a situation where I've watched so many situations in New York City where things collapse and then you fix it, rather than having a proactive approach to saying, how do we continue to be a progressive place? And again, I'll go back to the fact that I'm a child of the World's Fair, with monorails and flying cars and kind of spacecraft and space stations and deep space exploration, and, the new TWA terminal at JFK, beautiful new airport of the future, and people coming here from all over the world. So I was raised on this idea, right, of this. So to tell me that we can't do these things is because we've either not had the vision, or we don't have the nerve. So to tell me that the MTA and the subway system and the transportation system in New York City has to be a disaster is because either you are lying to me, or you're stupid, or so it's either incompetence, malevolence, ignorance, or imbecility. But when I can see the fact that China has built a high-speed rail network in less than 20 years that basically dwarfs anything else we've ever seen, I'm thinking, where's the initiative? And like I've said many times, as a country that was a nation of engineers in the 19th century and in the 20th century, now we've become a nation of managers. So what we've done is, now we've kind of taken away the troubleshooting, the adaptability, the initiative, the innovation, the problem solving, and we've replaced it with observations and examinations and regulations. And we've stifled those things that create that. In fact, what has happened was, NASA was the dream machine. NASA was where every kid went to dream about the horizon of dreams. And we were going to walk on Mars, and we were going to have deep space probes, and we were going to basically do all these things. And it wasn't that the people at NASA weren't ready for it. I remember meeting Bill Ketchum at a science fair that we were doing in San Diego. And I said, Bill, what happened? He goes, I don't know, man, I was ready. And I kind of like, if you don't know who Bill Ketchum is, look him up. You need to do that. You should know who he is. And I'm not going to do your homework for you, because I think I get angry sometimes when I get into these things. I had to talk about Eileen Collins this week, and it really bothered me because no one knows who Eileen Collins is. And Eileen Collins is one of the greatest heroes in American history. It's just that nobody knows her, and I'll tell you the reason why. Anyway, so we lost our nerve. We lost our ability to so we're now wallowing in these silly silly problems that we've created for ourselves because we lost our initiative to basically dream at the edge of a horizon of dreams. Right. And that's because we've kind of fallen below ourselves because we haven't kept up with understanding our destinies. I mean, the destiny we had in 1960 and in 1975 were such great destinies that we failed to fulfill them. And by 1990, we kind of fallen so far below ourselves, we couldn't even find our way back. Now we're in a situation where we're kind of talking about ridiculous things. Puddle, let me bring back to you because I wanted to finish that rant. So anyway, in terms of this, we need to understand how we get back to this. And now let me kind of read from the last kind of paragraphs of this piece by Whitehead, where he says, let's see, section 7. In this rapid survey of the rise and fall of civilizations, we have noted 4 factors which decisively govern the fate of social groups. Firstly, important, there stands the inexorable law that apart from some transcendent aim, the civilized life either wallows in pleasure or relapses slowly into a barren repetition with waning intensities of feeling. This could be something that could kind of indicate that what Ortega's talking about is a cyclical thing, right? Secondly, there stands the iron compulsion of nature that the bodily necessities of food, clothing, and shelter be provided. The rigid limits which are thereby set to modes of social existence can only be mitigated by the growth of an understanding by which the interplay between man and the rest of the nature can be adjusted. Okay, so that means understanding this thing is a necessity. It could be, again, and again, these books were written similar. I don't know much about the correspondence between Whitehead and Ortega were aware of each other. They understood each other's work. I'm sure they studied each other's work. There's a big section on Whitehead where Marias talks very favorably in the history of philosophy. So it is understood that they understood and appreciated the value of Whitehead. Okay, so thirdly, the compulsory domination of men over men has, and this is important because it also relates to what we talked about with Napoleon in France and Spain. Domination of men over men has a double significance. The first one's not that important, but the second one is. It has a benign, and he says, effect so far as it secures the coordination of behavioral necessity for social welfare, which is not important, but not as important as this. But it is fatal to extend this domination beyond the barest limits, the very liberal principle necessary for this coordination. And so the key is the organization. The progressive societies are those which most decisively have trusted themselves to the 4th factor, which is the way of persuasion. So the idea is this thing, which is this persuasive thing that evolves over time, has always been present, but now as the balance is shifted, gives us this opportunity to see these factors as the things that allow us to minimize contact in terms of the potential for overreach in order for people to kind of find that which is correct, what Ortega would call to rule, which is not to kind of force, right, or coercion, but basically to have that sense of strength, of conviction, and people to kind of feel confident in that conviction. So it's something where you say, we've persuaded, the sense of persuasion of the ideas has given this group of people the feeling that this is the correct path. Does that mean it is? No, not necessarily. But for the most part, that is the way that we found we have been able to kind of move towards that. And the idea, I think that's it's overlooked, is the fact that it's that idea of the less we have of man over man, or person over person, individual over individual, is a good societal indicator that we've made a sound choice, because I think when people can confidently move independently and freely towards a common goal, rather than being coerced or kind of like herded into a direction, it's usually because they feel fairly confident about it. And it's usually because the path seems fairly clear and easy. All right, Puddle, before I go on to something else, do you want to come in and interject with what you're going to say before? Because I have a couple of things I want to say before I wrap up, but I don't want to kind of like, I want to either do it or move on.
What I was going to say was that a perfect example of a society that has made its many problems minor through engineering is the Netherlands.
True.
Which is a country, a very small place with a lot of natural problems
like
that had
Japan.
to overcome. Yes, and like Japan, but the Dutch excel in engineering. They would be underwater if they weren't. They would have all sorts of problems.
Right.
And they've used engineering and architecture, industrial, design to really solve huge life problems.
Right. Right. So the thing is,
and it's a very big contrast to California.
It's true. It's true. And the thing is, like I said, I mean, is the fact that it's not only the circumstance of how, it's not only the way in which you deal and prepare for a circumstance. And we contrast the difference between, say, Japan and Turkey or in California, is that Turkey never tried to prepare. California lost sight of the fact that they had to prepare. Japan did prepare. And in the case where all three of them failed, the sad thing was, in the case of Japan, this was something that really kind of caught them off guard and was kind of like unforeseeable to a large degree. In the case of California, this was harsh, but not unforeseeable.
No, it was quite
right. It was very foreseeable. And the case of Turkey, it was something that was certainly understandable, but it was never a concern because it was never made a priority. Which, when I first started to think of that idea of a kind of position, and that kind of goes back to an idea I'll talk about later, which is the kind of social responsibility of architects and engineers. One of the things I think that there is a reason why we failed in terms of our leadership is, and again, I'm going to say it. I think the reason why we failed in terms of leadership is the fact that the people who lead us are not the best and the brightest. I mean, they're lawyers and businessmen, and lawyers are good at litigation. They're good at regulation. They're good at basically kind of creating, stumbling blocks. And that's not all they do, because there are, they do make laws, and some of the laws that they make, like the Constitution and things like that. But again, I wonder, there's a difference between writing the Constitution and basically servicing the Constitution. I think there was a brilliant document that was generated in the Constitution. It's allowed us to kind of be able to kind of, through a federal republic, have an incredibly diverse nation. And I don't just mean diverse in the fact that we have a lot of different races and colors and creeds. We have a lot of different walks of life that can understand through their interpretation of the Constitution the fact that there's a difference between a farmer and a broker. And there's a difference between a celebrity hairdresser and a person who works in a mill or a mine. And as a result, that document has been valuable. So anyway, back to the fact that now, how do we support that move towards civilization as we have gotten away from that? And kind of like, let me go back to this. And so what he says now is that the fourth factor, which is the way of persuasion, amidst all the activities of mankind, there are three which certainly have promoted this last factor in human life. They are family affection aroused in sex relations and the nurture of children, intellectual curiosity leading to enjoyment in the exchange of ideas, and as soon as large-scale societal arose, the practice of commerce. But beyond these special activities, a greater bond of sympathy has arisen. This bond is a growth of reverence for the power in virtue of which nature harbors ideal ends. And the idea of ideal ends is actually a really beautiful way of saying, what is our vision? What is our goal? Right? And produces individual beings capable And there's the thing, produces those individuals. I mean, Ortega talks about the fact that there's that person who puts no demands on himself and feels as if that's perfectly reasonable, and it's not. And this is what he says. In this case, Whitehead is saying that person can be nurtured. And it's something that we should think about in terms of it. And again, if you read Aims of Education, which is, I think, again, probably that was probably the first piece I read and the first pieces I read into Whitehead when I was introduced to him, which now I guess is about 10, 15 years. But I feel as if that really makes sense in the fact that it's important to create that individual. But beyond these special activities, a greater bond of sympathy has arisen. This bond is the growth of reverence for that power in virtue of which nature harbors ideal ends, right? Nature harbors ideal ends, right? And produces individuals being capable of conscious discrimination of such ends. And that's not that different from the idea of I am myself and my circumstance, understanding my destiny, and basically seeing that as a generational thing. Now, again, these people are very different. They come from different backgrounds, but again, they're contemporaries and they're aware of each other. Again, I'm not a philosopher, but I do know that at least they were aware of each other. Did they have correspondence? Did they talk to each other? Probably not. But I mean, it's interesting to see these two very different individuals, right? One, basically a logician, mathematician, scientist, person who was basically in the technical fields, who kind of moved towards metaphysics, as opposed to Ortega, who studied in Marburg with the Neo-Kantians and basically was maybe kind of overwhelmed by the death of metaphysics as a result of kind of Kantian understanding of the kind of situation of unable to kind of verify metaphysical speculation coming from his understanding of Hume, and that idea that metaphysics was somehow stumbled. So in a way, they come to these things from different directions. They're kind of like the kind of sense of moroseness and sense of kind of dire desperation in Ortega seems to have a kind of even though they're talking about similar ideas, there's a kind of hopefulness in these words. Because again, given the engine of the nature of process and reality and process velocity and the nature of becoming as opposed to being, and overturning that kind of that kind of 2,500-year-old idea of the fact of the paradox that we had with appearance and reality, now that kind of gets kind of reformed in a way that it doesn't become the stumbling block that we kind of end up with within Kant. So to finish off, and again, I'm going through these things quickly, so maybe a lot of them are garbage anyway, but anyway, it's helped me understand these things. So I can't believe this. I thought this would be like a 15-minute one, but it's really, I think it's because there's a lot of really interesting things here. Okay. This bond is, okay. And produces individual beings capable of conscious discrimination of such ends. And I think that word of the discrimination, the discernment, the ability to understand is a key thing. And in the idea of organization of thought, which is in the series of the essays and Aims of Education, it talks about the fact that, and also in Aims of Education, is creating people who have that ability to nurture that ability in the individual. This reverence is the foundation of the respect for man as man. It thereby secures that liberty of thought. And that's another important idea, liberty of thought, which we talked about, the idea of liberty and freedom and action required for the upward adventure of life on this earth, meaning moving towards the civilization, as he talks about in this, which he talks about at the very beginning in the first words in the preface, which is, the title of this book, Adventure of Ideas, bears two meanings, both applicable to the subject matter. One meaning in the effect of certain ideas in promoting the slow drift of mankind towards civilization. This is the adventure of ideas in the history of mankind. The other meaning is the author's adventures in framing a speculative scheme of ideas, which shall be explanatory in the historical adventure, which again, I kind of thought was interesting because it kind of talks about this idea, which reminds me of Diderot's encyclopedia, which is, hey guys, don't lose the map. You know what I mean? Because if you do, we don't want to go back to where we were before because it was kind of sucked. All right, so that was fun. I got really fired up, and I kind of think that I said a lot of things that were absolute nonsense and gibberish, but I enjoyed saying them because they kind of helped me kind of fire to think about things. So next week, let's see. Good one. Tradition and culture. Tradition and culture was something that I kind of talked about early on. I kind of wanted to be a little ahead of it, but now I'm kind of jumping back. It's something what I talked about was the difference, and it kind of is related to kind of like technique and the unbreakable bond between like technology and science, as opposed to technology and superstition and religion and some other kind of things that had not had the kind of visceral nature that allowed us to make kind of consequential kind of like adaptations and advancements, which again is something that kind of became an unbreakable bond. Now, a lot of these things are my language, but it's kind of how I've processed my ideas from the people that I've read. And again, though I have read broadly, I feel as if I've read deeply in a narrow field, because I feel as if, like, I'm not going to, I will say very little about Whitehead because I kind of haven't read Whitehead. I read some things. I read some things about, Wittgenstein. I've read more about Whitehead than I've read Wittgenstein. I've read some of Heidegger, but I kind of felt as if like I could read a lot of Heidegger by reading Ortega. I've read a lot of Nietzsche, but I kind of find as time goes on, it's like as far as kind of like his particular brand of reasoning, I find that he's someone who's a kind of great ambassador of thinking, but I don't really find that any of his kind of formulations kind of hold as anything, over the long haul. Again, Hume, and I think one of the great books of, maybe the second greatest book written after the Bible. And again, I'm not professing that the Bible is a great book because I'm a Christian, because I'm not a Christian and I don't believe in God. But I believe that the Bible is probably one of the most important books that was ever written. But I think the second most important book, if it's not the most important book, was The Origin of Species by Darwin. Anyway, so next we're going to talk about tradition and culture and that distinction, because I think that distinction is key in terms of my thinking about how I look at architecture and a circumstance within that. And then we'll go back to, again, it's funny, I never really thought about this, but there's almost like an intertwining of kind of things towards people and Ortega and Whitehead. I could probably maybe do one specific about that, but I kind of find it's interesting that I look through these things. There's a lot of things, because the truth, beauty, and love, beauty and truth are Whitehead's obsessions. And again, he talks about a lot of adventurous ideas, but love is something that Ortega talks about as as kind of like the binding force. All right. So anyway, that's it for now. And I think, like I said, this was fun. It went really long, but I think that's it for now. So next week will be tradition and culture. And let me leave you, as I always do, with the realm of ideas is free to all. And it's to the benefit of all for us to maintain things that way. Thank you.